In the remote Appalachians of Monroe County, West Virginia, 26 hunters vanished without a trace between 1897 and 1899. The Holloway sisters, Prudence and Verity, inherited their late father's homestead and lived 12 miles from the nearest settlement, a distance measured not in steps but in the endurance of days crossing the mountain trails. When a dying hunter staggered into the town of Danforth in 1899, fevered and incoherent, speaking of tunnels beneath the Holloway cabin and men bound in chains, Deputy Sheriff Elias Crane was compelled to confront a horror that seemed almost beyond reason. Beneath the sisters' weathered log home sprawled a labyrinth of rock and timber, a network of underground chambers where men were kept as instruments of a purpose both devout and monstrous. How such terror persisted undetected for years, and how faith and isolation could coalesce into deliberate cruelty, became questions Crane would carry into sleepless nights. Monroe County in 1897 seemed impervious to the transformation sweeping much of America. The mountains rolled in misty blue ridges, clothed in dense hardwood forests of chestnut, oak, and maple. Sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, falling in pallid shafts through tangled branches. Settlements clung precariously to hollows and valley flats, often consisting of 3 or 4 families at most. Telegraph lines did not yet straddle these mountains, and the nearest railhead lay 20 miles across ridges few dared to traverse in winter. A man could disappear into the hills and never be seen again. The land had claimed its share of lives since the first settlers arrived, and the dead and lost became whispers on the wind. The scars of the Civil War still marred the region. Roads were poor, bridges precarious, and isolated families relied on subsistence farming, hunting, and trapping to survive. Fur trapping remained a primary source of income. Each autumn, men ventured into remote valleys and along the creeks to hunt beaver, mink, and otter, whose pelts could be sold at small trading posts in towns like Danforth or further afield in Lewisburg. These trappers were skilled woodsmen, accustomed to the dangers of steep terrain, sudden storms, and the cunning of wild predators. Into this harsh landscape, the Holloway sisters had carved out a life considered eccentric by outsiders, but unremarkable to those familiar with mountain isolation. Their father, Josiah Holloway, had earned a modest reputation for distilling moonshine deep in a hollow far from town. When he died in a hunting accident in 1895, Prudence and Verity assumed control of the 150-acre homestead, continuing his clandestine production. Local lore hinted at their oddities. Prudence, tall and austere, was said to speak in scriptural quotations at odd intervals. Verity, younger and quieter, was described as watching the forest with a patience that unsettled visitors. Outsiders accepted them as strange but harmless, their isolation providing them a natural shield from suspicion. A traveling peddler, Thomas Riggs, visited the Holloway homestead in the autumn of 1896 during his circuit of Monroe County. He remembered the visit with a clarity he often recounted with discomfort. The sisters' cabin seemed almost to grow out of the mountainside itself, a solid structure of logs, stone, and clay. Outbuildings clustered nearby, and behind the main cabin, the hillside bore curious carved recesses, indistinct at first glance, but suggesting human modification. Prudence conducted all business, speaking with a confidence that unsettled Riggs, while Verity remained silent, her gaze tracking him with an intensity that suggested both calculation and vigilance. Riggs noted the incongruities of their purchases: expensive bolts of cloth, fine metal tools, and, most conspicuously, heavy iron chains and locking hardware. Prudence explained they were intended to secure livestock from bears or mountain lions. An explanation that, while plausible on the surface, lingered in Riggs's mind as odd. The disappearances began the following year. In October 1897, Jonathan Prout, a trapper from Virginia, failed to return from his hunting expedition along the Little Greenbrier Creek. His family initially assumed he had prolonged his trapping to maximize pelts, or perhaps moved westward for opportunity. When spring arrived without word, They filed a missing persons report in Danforth. Similar incidents followed. Experienced hunters vanished with no trace, no abandoned camps, no scattered tools, no bodies. Unlike ordinary misadventures, these men were known for their survival skills. Crane, newly appointed deputy sheriff, but seasoned in observation and persistence, noted the improbability. Men disappeared in the mountains regularly, but these cases formed a pattern, 7 vanishings clustered in a narrow stretch of wilderness. Crane began a meticulous review of the reports, interviewing families and mapping the last known locations. The territory at the center of the pattern was the Holloway property. Local hunters avoided the area, citing unease rather than tangible danger. They spoke of the Sisters Hollow in hushed tones, an expression that suggested not just avoidance, but fear. Though no one could articulate why 2 women might threaten strong men, Crane's experience told him to trust patterns over assumptions. Some deliberate agency, was at work. The first expedition to the Holloway property took place in April 1899, Crane accompanied by a local guide who knew the treacherous mountain paths. The journey required 2 days of hard travel, involving narrow ridges, fast, flowing streams, and dense thickets that tore clothing and scratched skin. The guide recounted that the Holloways valued isolation, that Josiah had deliberately chosen the hollow so that his distilling operation might continue uninterrupted. Crane noted the cabin's sturdy construction, the evidence of careful labor, and the oddities in supply. Worn clothing and simple furnishings belied an abundance of quality tools, fine cloth, and provisions that hinted at wealth beyond ordinary means. Prudence Holloway stood nearly 6 feet tall, her gray, streaked hair pulled tightly back, eyes blue and unnervingly direct. Verity remained silent, her presence measured, each movement deliberate. Crane introduced his purpose, accounting for missing trappers. Prudence spoke readily, describing the occasional hunter who came seeking trade, sharing meals or spirits in exchange for information on local streams and game. She gave plausible explanations for some disappearances, a man seeking fortune in the West, another troubled by personal matters, some simply moving on. Her words, measured and calm, were framed with scripture, passages she quoted as if they were practical advice rather than holy writ. Yet Crane observed contradictions. The sisters' poverty seemed performative. Their cabin, while weathered, concealed resources and craftsmanship that suggested careful accumulation. Requests to explore the property were met with polite acquiescence, though Prudence subtly steered him away from the hillside behind the homestead, where carved doors set into the rock face hinted at hidden spaces. Crane's suspicion deepened. The statistical improbability of the disappearances, coupled with the sisters' isolation, their curious purchasing habits, and the hidden doors, suggested a reality far darker than any simple accident. The breakthrough came not through careful observation, but through desperate circumstance. On September 12, 1899, a man staggered into Danforth at dawn, clothes tattered, skin scarred, and infected wounds evident on his wrists and ankles. Dr. Leonard Harkins recognized the severity immediately and had him carried into his residence. The man, Samuel Whitlock, was 29, a hunter from Tennessee, and in fevered fragments described chains, underground chambers, and the sisters' divine plan. Though delirious, he repeated certain phrases. The hollow, the chains, the selection, they speak of God's will. His account, corroborated with physical evidence, indicated captivity, malnutrition, and prolonged abuse. Whitlock died 3 days later, but not before providing sufficient detail to guide an investigation, the location of hidden doors, tunnel layouts, and even the names of other men he had encountered in the underground chambers. Crane reviewed Whitlock's statements, mapping them against missing persons reports. The statistical anomaly could no longer be ignored. 26 men had vanished from the Holloway territory over a span of 2 years. All were experienced hunters or trappers, all vanished without trace. The local authorities, long accustomed to disappearances attributed to weather, animals, or human caprice, were slow to believe that two women could orchestrate such a systematic terror. Crane, however, recognized the combination of isolation, secrecy, and careful selection as the mechanism by which the Holloway sisters had remained unobserved. The Holloway homestead, when finally approached, seemed innocuous. Smoke from the chimney, a log cabin settled into the hollow, but beneath its surface, history and cruelty had been concealed. Crane noted the carved recesses in the hillside, doors hidden against stone, and the suggestion that human labor had shaped a labyrinth beneath the mountain. Each detail, mundane to the untrained eye, confirmed the growing impression that the sisters' work extended beyond ordinary lawlessness. In the mountains, the exceptional often remained unseen, and in the Holloway's case, it had festered for years. The community, largely unaware of the scale of what occurred, had long accepted the mountains as dangerous and mysterious, where men came and went, often never returning. But Crane understood that the Holloways represented something different. This was not random misfortune, it was deliberate, premeditated, and organized. Every purchase, every hidden door, every unexplained absence formed a pattern that would soon be revealed as far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Beneath the log cabin, among the roots of the mountainside, a darkness had grown, one that faith, obsession, and isolation had nourished, waiting for discovery, yet leaving whispers and rumors to permeate the valleys long before the law arrived. By late April 1899, Deputy Elias Crane had resolved to conduct a thorough expedition to the Holloway homestead. The missing hunters' reports, combined with Samuel Whitlock's fevered account, left little room for doubt. Something malignant thrived in that hollow. Crane secured the aid of Jonathan Merrick, a local woodsman familiar with the steepest ridges and densest thickets, whose knowledge of Monroe County's hidden paths was indispensable. The journey itself was grueling. Narrow, eroded trails snaked along cliffs above roaring creeks, while thick underbrush and fallen timber forced Crane and Merrick to proceed with care. Even the slightest misstep could mean injury or death. Merrick spoke little, but when he did, his words were measured, revealing the collective unease of mountain folk toward the Holloway property. "The Holloways keep to themselves," he said, voice low. "Never see them come to town. Folks say, well, some folks say things happen down there that a decent man shouldn't talk about." Crane noted the vagueness of the warning. It was the kind of caution born from generations of whispered observation, where children were told to avoid certain hollows, but never told why. Such reticence, he knew, often indicated more than superstition. It suggested survival. The Holloway cabin appeared as the mountains themselves had grown it, logs darkened by time, stone chimney crumbling at its base, outbuildings scattered haphazardly across the clearing. Prudence Holloway emerged first, a tall, angular figure whose gray, streaked hair and piercing blue eyes bespoke both age and rigid command. Verity lingered in the shadows, silent, eyes tracking Crane with an intensity that unsettled even the seasoned deputy. Crane introduced himself, noting carefully that his inquiry concerned missing hunters. Prudence's reply was calm, deliberate, the cadence of speech practiced and precise. She acknowledged that hunters occasionally sought supplies or news of game, but she insisted no harm had come to any man who visited. Whitlock, she said, must have been mistaken, or suffering from the wilderness fever that afflicted many who spent too long in the mountains. Crane noted the incongruities. Worn clothing and humble furnishings belied the quality of tools, cloth, and provisions visible through open windows and partially ajar doors. When he requested to survey the property, Prudence agreed, but with subtle redirection. She showed the cabin and immediate outbuildings, but guided Crane away from several wooden doors, embedded in the hillside behind the homestead. Though he did not press the point, the doors suggested subterranean construction, and Crane's mind returned repeatedly to Whitlock's fragmented account chains, captivity, breeding, words that lingered like smoke in his thoughts. On September 12, 1899, a man named Samuel Whitlock stumbled into Danforth. His appearance confirmed Crane's suspicions. Whitlock's wrists and ankles bore deep lacerations consistent with shackling, his body emaciated and infected. The man's fever was violent, and he drifted between lucidity and delirium. Dr. Leonard Harkins documented every utterance. Whitlock spoke of underground chambers, of other men confined there, of an almost religious imperative guiding the Holloway sisters' actions. He referred repeatedly to the selection, to the blood, and to passages of scripture invoked as justification for acts no scripture could condone. Crane studied Whitlock's expressions, noting the tremor in his hands and the desperation in his eyes. Every fragment of speech carried the weight of survival against impossible odds. Whitlock described the first moments of his captivity with chilling clarity. Prudence Holloway's calm voice inviting him to drink from a cup, followed by a sudden darkness and the cold bite of chains. He recalled other men, barely coherent, confined to the underground chambers. Days merged into nights in a labyrinth of rock and timber, where the sisters' visits were the only source of food and water, their presence framed as divine instruction. Whitlock's escape, he explained, had relied on the smallest error. Verity's carelessness during a feeding left his restraints slightly loose. Over days, he worked free one hand, and then another, ultimately overpowering Verity with her own knife before fleeing across the treacherous mountains toward civilization. Though Whitlock's survival was miraculous, the wounds he sustained told a story as much as his words. Infected scratches and gashes, the bruises of prolonged restraint, and the skeletal gauntness of his frame demonstrated months of neglect and cruelty. Crane's methodical mind parsed every detail. Whitlock's testimony aligned with the patterns of disappearance, supply irregularities, and the hidden doors on the hillside. The pieces formed a coherent, if horrifying, whole. The Holloway sisters maintained an underground network, capturing men under the guise of hospitality, and engaged in practices rooted in their interpretation of divine purpose. Crane compiled Whitlock's account alongside missing persons reports, mapping the last known locations of all 26 men. Each name, each disappearance, each fragment of observation reinforced a chilling pattern. All were experienced hunters or trappers, familiar with the hazards of Monroe County's mountains. These were men unlikely to succumb to mere accident or misadventure. The Holloway property, long considered eccentric but harmless, emerged as the epicenter of an orchestrated campaign of abduction and imprisonment. The community's response to the investigation was muted, marked by disbelief and fear. Mountain families, accustomed to the whims of terrain and weather, were unprepared to comprehend deliberate cruelty on such a scale, especially perpetrated by two women. Crane noted in his journal the difficulty of securing cooperation. County officials demanded extraordinary proof for actions that defied conventional understanding. Whitlock's condition, while severe, seemed insufficient to convince bureaucrats accustomed to rational explanation. Crane persisted, documenting every symptom, every physical sign of captivity, every fragment of recollection, as though meticulous record keeping could anchor reason against encroaching horror. By early October 1899, Crane had convinced state authorities that federal assistance was necessary. The remoteness of the Holloway property and the severity of Whitlock's claims required more manpower and expertise than Monroe County could provide. 6 federal marshals agreed to accompany Crane into the mountains. Each briefed carefully on what Whitlock's testimony suggested they might encounter: subterranean chambers, restrained captives, and individuals trained in the manipulation and control of those stronger than themselves. The risk was considerable. The sisters' isolation, knowledge of the terrain, and apparent ruthlessness made the expedition dangerous. Preparation was methodical. Supplies for extended fieldwork, lanterns, chains, and medical kits were assembled. Crane stressed caution. emphasizing that the Holloway's survival and evasion depended on secrecy and knowledge of the mountains. The marshals trained to respond to resistance, to unexpected threats, and to the possibility that men might be held in unknown configurations deep underground. Each step of planning reflected the extraordinary nature of the case. This was not a simple crime but a network of captivity and ideological obsession that had persisted for years. The expedition departed at dawn, climbing over ridges slick with rain and negotiating narrow paths bordered by sudden drops. Wildlife stirred nervously in the underbrush. Birds took flight at their approach. Crane observed signs of habitation, disturbed soil, faint footprints, remnants of campfires. Each marker indicated a presence hidden, a consciousness aware of intrusion. By mid-afternoon, the cabin came into view. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, giving the impression of domestic normalcy. Yet Crane felt the weight of expectation pressing against him. Within lay secrets that could unravel decades of assumed safety. Prudence Holloway greeted the party alone, emerging from the cabin door with composed dignity. Her tall frame, angular features, and sharp gaze conveyed authority and preparedness. Verity remained hidden, a shadow against the logs, her eyes fixed on Crane and the marshals. The initial encounter was tense but controlled. Prudence's speech was measured, her explanations plausible, and her hospitality perfunctory. Crane allowed her words to flow, noting inconsistencies only a trained observer could detect. The subtle avoidance of certain areas, the careful framing of events, and the deflection of inquiries about specific men. In the hills behind the cabin, the carved doors hinted at what lay beneath. Crane's mind returned to Whitlock's account: chains, captivity, a purpose he described as divine. The sisters, preparation, Prudence's controlled demeanor, Verity's silent observation, all suggested a network of precision and deliberate action. Crane documented each observation with clinical detachment, aware that the smallest misstep could endanger himself, his men, or potential captives still hidden within the mountain. As the expedition camped nearby that night, Crane reviewed the patterns one final time. The disappearances, the hidden doors, the inconsistent accounts, and Whitlock's detailed descriptions all formed a tapestry of horror. Each missing man's name now carried significance, their absence a thread in the fabric of the Holloway's plan. Crane understood that discovery was imminent, but that the consequences of confrontation remained unknown. The mountains had held their secrets for decades. Now, the law would enter, and what lay beneath the Holloway homestead would be brought into the light, at last. The following morning, Crane led the party toward the carved doors embedded in the mountainside, the heavy timbers appearing almost grown from the rock itself. Prudence Holloway had shown them the immediate property, but the concealed entrances beyond the cabin remained shrouded in shadow, their existence hinted at in Whitlock's fragmented account. Crane's men approached cautiously, weapons ready, each step measured against the slick moss and loose stone of the incline. The forest pressed close, the high branches forming a vault that filtered the sunlight into sickly green bands across their path. Every noise, the crack of a twig underfoot, the distant call of a crow, was magnified in the stillness of the hollow. Prudence did not accompany them this time. Verity's presence was noted only as a shifting shadow at the periphery, silent, observing. Crane paused before the largest door, its iron hinges rusted but serviceable, its surface scored with scratches that suggested repeated use over years. He knocked firmly, calling the Holloway's names, and waited. No response came, save for the whispering wind through the trees. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Crane signaled Merrick to assist in prying the door open. It resisted at first, but with steady effort the timbers yielded to reveal a passage descending into darkness. The air that spilled forth was cool, damp, and carried the faintest, yet unmistakable, odor of decay. The descent was slow and deliberate. Lanterns were lit, their flickering light revealing walls of stone chiseled smooth by hand. The tunnel narrowed in places, forcing men to stoop or turn sideways. Each step seemed measured against the weight of centuries of solitude and secret labor. Crane recorded measurements, sketched rough diagrams, and marked positions of intersections with chalk. Every detail was considered evidence, each observation a potential key to understanding what lay hidden beneath the Holloway homestead. The first chamber was small but furnished crudely. A straw mattress lay in a corner, worn and unclean. A wooden bucket, stained dark with time and neglect, rested nearby. The air was thick with human sweat and excrement, the mixture pungent and oppressive. Chains hung from the walls in loops and hooks, empty now, but their presence suggested repeated and deliberate use. Crane noted their placement with meticulous care, aware that even the slightest misinterpretation could obscure the nature of the horrors that had transpired here. Deeper still, the tunnels branched into a more extensive network. Crane's lantern illuminated a room large enough to contain several men lying side by side. Rusted chains and iron collars were scattered across the floor. The room exuded an air of deliberate confinement, the dimensions calculated to limit movement without compromising the basic capacity to sustain life. Crane's training as a lawman merged with his methodical temperament. He catalogued every item, every mark, every scratch upon the walls, as if the stones themselves might reveal the intent behind them. In this chamber, evidence of prolonged captivity became undeniable. Wetlock had spoken of other men here, men now long absent, but signs of their presence were everywhere. Scraps of clothing, worn shoes, tools left behind in haste. Crane recognized the patterns of abuse, scratches and indentations on walls, where prisoners had attempted escape, discoloration of stone where bodies had rested for extended periods, the faint traces of human excrement and urine in corners long abandoned. These were not casual acts, they were systematic, deliberate, and cruel. Further exploration revealed more disturbing features. Smaller rooms, almost cell-like, contained remnants of personal items: a small knife, a frayed handkerchief, a belt buckle. Each fragment offered the grim possibility of identification, the hope that names of missing men could be matched to these artifacts. Crane carefully documented every item, aware that in 1899, forensic science remained rudimentary, and yet meticulous observation could provide clarity where technology could not. The Holloways' devotion to their purpose became evident in subtle ways. Carvings in the stone suggested a numerical system, perhaps a method of tracking captives or births. Faded notes etched into the walls hinted at a chronology, a record, keeping that mirrored Whitlock's account. Crane understood that the sisters had meticulously documented their acts, both to assert control over their victims and to record their own interpretation of divine intent. The cold precision of these records reflected a mind capable of methodical cruelty, tempered by fanaticism. As the party pressed further, the tunnels opened into a chamber unlike the others. Here, the air was thick with a mixture of human waste, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of blood. 3 figures huddled in a corner, their bodies small, emaciated, and pale from years without sunlight. Crane and the marshals froze, recognizing children, not men. Their ages appeared between 3 and 7 years, their limbs thin and frail. The children recoiled instinctively from the lantern light, their primitive sounds a mixture of fear and confusion. Crane approached slowly, speaking in soft tones, attempting to convey that they meant no harm. The physical condition of these children was severe. Malnutrition had left ribs and joints prominent, muscles underdeveloped from lack of movement, and skin nearly translucent under the lantern glow. They had never seen sunlight, never experienced human interaction beyond the Holloway sisters' limited care, and their development, both physical and cognitive, had been stunted by prolonged isolation. Crane recognized the uniqueness of their predicament, the impossibility of providing immediate restoration. These were children born in captivity, conditioned to darkness, unaware of the world above their subterranean prison. Beyond this chamber, the tunnels continued to a series of burial areas. Crane and the marshals, grim and methodical, recorded 26 bodies in various stages of decay. Some were skeletal, indicating death years prior. Others bore signs of more recent mortality. The arrangement of remains suggested systematic placement rather than disorderly disposal, reinforcing Whitlock's claim of methodical cruelty. Evidence of restraint, malnutrition, and trauma was obvious even to those untrained in medicine or forensics. Crane documented each corpse, noting distinguishing features for eventual identification: hair color, stature, clothing remnants. Personal effects corroborated missing persons reports, linking names to remains. Among these artifacts was Prudence Holloway's own diary, concealed within the lining of a quilt. Crane discovered it carefully stitched, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting detailing the capture and treatment of each man. Dates, physical descriptions, and behavioral notes revealed the sisters' obsession with bloodlines, their belief in divine sanction, and their commitment to preserving what they considered uncorrupted mountain lineage. The diary's pages included repeated scripture citations, particularly passages emphasizing fruitfulness, multiplication, and obedience, which Prudence used to rationalize systematic captivity and breeding. No hint of remorse appeared. Frustration, yes, but only when her experiments failed to achieve the precise outcomes she demanded. The marshals and Crane moved cautiously, aware that this discovery represented not only evidence, but also the extent of human cruelty concealed within a landscape otherwise untouched by law. They observed remnants of crude bedding, containers for food and water, and instruments for restraint. Each object spoke to years of deliberate labor, a slow accumulation of methodical horror. Whitlock's descriptions, fevered and fragmented though they had been, matched almost precisely the physical evidence now laid bare before them. Dr. Harkins, present to provide medical assessment, examined the surviving children thoroughly. Malnutrition, untreated infections, and extreme psychological trauma were apparent. The children had learned only minimal language, their vocalizations rudimentary, formed from years of isolation. Their fear of open spaces suggested an innate terror of sunlight, of freedom, of any environment beyond the confining walls of the Holloway tunnels. Even with immediate care, their recovery remained uncertain. Harkins recorded every observation: weight, height, skin tone, signs of infection, responses to light and sound. The children's plight was unprecedented in the region, and Harkins' journal reflected both medical concern and profound sorrow. The Holloway sisters' home, when finally surveyed above ground, offered no hint of the labyrinth below. The log cabin, the outbuildings, the carved doors in the hillside, all appeared ordinary, even quaint, to a casual observer. Yet the hidden chambers, the methodical cruelty, and the surviving witnesses revealed a darker truth. The sisters had exploited isolation, skill, and knowledge of the terrain to commit acts that law, medicine, and human compassion struggled to comprehend. By the close of the day, Crane had compiled a preliminary report, sketching maps of the tunnel network, cataloging remains, and recording observations of the surviving children. The scale of the Holloway's crimes exceeded anything previously documented in Monroe County. 26 men disappeared, 3 children survived in varying states of trauma, and every detail suggested planning, devotion, and a fanatic belief in divine purpose. The investigation was far from complete, but the evidence demanded immediate action. As night fell over the hollow, Crane reflected on the mountains themselves. The forest, the ridges, and the dense underbrush had concealed the Holloway sisters' work for years. Nature had been both accomplice and witness, its remoteness providing sanctuary for cruelty. Crane recognized that even now, the mountains would not easily relinquish all their secrets. The expedition had unveiled only a fraction of what lay beneath the surface, and the implications, legal, social, and moral, would echo far beyond the hollowed valley. The days that followed the initial exploration of the Holloway tunnels were consumed with meticulous documentation, collection of evidence, and attempts to stabilize the surviving children. Dr. Leonard Harkins remained with the group, tending to their fragile physical state, while Deputy Elias Crane and the marshals worked systematically to trace every passage, catalog every item, and record every remnant of human presence. The mountain hollow seemed to stretch endlessly below the cabin, a subterranean warren carved by patient hands and driven by fanatic devotion. The full extent of its labyrinthine architecture became apparent only as Crane descended further into passages previously unexplored, mapping branches that seemed to follow no logical pattern beyond concealment and confinement. Prudence Holloway's diary proved indispensable. Its pages contained a record of each man brought into the Holloway homestead, descriptions of their physical and mental attributes, and notes on behaviors deemed suitable for her divine experiment. She had catalogued, with disturbing precision, strength, resilience, intelligence, and obedience, marking certain men as preferable breeding candidates. Crane read each entry with a combination of professional detachment and visceral unease. Here was the thought process of a woman who had taken ordinary mountain life and infused it with calculated cruelty, all under the guise of faith and providence. Whitlock's account had been fragmented and fevered, yet it aligned seamlessly with the physical evidence now revealed in the tunnels. Crane traced the route Whitlock described, identifying small alcoves and chambers, the placement of chains, and areas where food and water had been delivered. Every detail corroborated the dying trapper's testimony. The Holloway sisters had designed the environment to control, break, and monitor their captives. The methods were both cruel and methodical, reflecting not merely opportunity or madness, but a carefully structured ideology. The surviving children became both a focus of medical attention and a source of insight into the sisters' practices. Dr. Harkins noted that even limited responses to light, sound, and human contact were indicative of extreme sensory deprivation. The children had spent their formative years in darkness, conditioned to respond to the sisters' movements and voices alone. Their reactions to light were violent, flinching, cowering, and vocalizations that could only be described as panic. It was evident that years of confinement had instilled fear, not just of the physical environment, but of the broader world itself. Harkins meticulously recorded each response, understanding that these observations would be vital in both medical and legal proceedings. Beyond the chambers of the children and the deceased, Crane's exploration uncovered areas suggesting ongoing experiments. Small, crudely fashioned tables and implements were arranged in patterns implying observation or measurement. Marks on the stone walls indicated tracking, numbering, or some form of notation that had long faded. Crane hypothesized that these areas had been used to document growth, behavior, or other physical attributes of captives, a form of empirical observation filtered through a lens of obsession and faith. Even in the absence of surviving human subjects, the spaces themselves bore witness to the sisters' intentions, control, documentation, and the pursuit of an idealized bloodline. The marshals moved cautiously throughout the tunnels, aware that any misstep could compromise evidence or personal safety. Some chambers contained simple furnishings, others only the bare imprint of life, and yet others were designated for confinement and restraint. Each discovery reinforced the systematic nature of the Holloway's operations. Crane's journals, detailed sketches, and notes would later serve as the foundation for the official investigation, capturing the precise layout of the subterranean complex, the arrangement of human remains, and the placement of tools and implements used in captivity. Above ground, the Holloway homestead retained an air of deceptive normalcy. To any casual observer, the log cabin and outbuildings appeared ordinary, even unremarkable. The carved doors in the hillside, however, concealed the true horror beneath. Crane noted the contrast between the pastoral facade and the subterranean labyrinth, understanding that the sisters had relied on the mountains' natural isolation to carry out their acts, unseen. Their ability to maintain this dual existence, a surface of apparent rural simplicity and an underground network of cruelty, reflected both cunning and audacity. Attempts to interview the Holloway sisters, or to determine their presence in the immediate vicinity, proved impossible. Prudence had already chosen her fatal course, consuming the vial that ended her life, rather than reveal the full extent of her knowledge. Verity's violent resistance and subsequent death removed any remaining opportunity to interrogate the pair directly. Thus, the surviving children, the diary, and the physical evidence within the tunnels became the sole sources from which investigators could reconstruct the events that had transpired. In one chamber, Crane discovered remnants that hinted at the sisters' intentions regarding the surviving children. Small, crude carvings in the stone depicted symbols, numbers, and cryptic notations interpreted by Harkins as attempts to track growth or development. The children themselves, though largely nonverbal, exhibited behaviors suggesting repeated exposure to instruction, observation, and manipulation. The Holloway's obsession with preservation of bloodlines extended beyond immediate captives. It had influenced the very conditions of birth and upbringing, shaping the next generation according to their own rigid and dangerous ideals. Crane recognized the limitations of contemporary law enforcement and social services. In 1899, there existed no framework for addressing trauma on such a scale, particularly when it originated from prolonged and deliberate captivity. The surviving children were transported to an orphanage in Little Rock, where staff struggled to provide care and rehabilitation. Harkins accompanied them, providing medical treatment while recording detailed observations for future reference. Despite these efforts, the children's development remained impaired. They were physically fragile, emotionally stunted, and socially unprepared. The years spent in darkness had created deficits that could not be fully repaired. The discovery of the burial chambers, containing 26 men, confirmed the systematic nature of the Holloway's crimes. Each body was catalogued, noting distinguishing features, approximate age, and condition of remains. Personal effects provided confirmation for several identities: William Harlan, Joseph Metzger, Thomas Langley, and others. Crane Cross referenced these identifications with missing persons reports, establishing a clear chronology of abductions, confinement, and eventual death. The evidence left no doubt the Holloways had engaged in sustained, methodical acts of captivity and murder, driven by ideology and facilitated by geographic isolation. Dr. Harkins' medical journals reflected both clinical observation and profound ethical concern. He documented malnutrition, untreated injuries, and stunted development in surviving children. He noted signs of psychological trauma fear responses, limited vocalization, hypervigilance, and extreme attachment or aversion to caretakers. The children's responses to light and movement were violent, illustrating the deep imprint of their subterranean environment. Harkins concluded that while medical intervention could address some physical ailments, the psychological damage would likely persist for life. The Holloways' documentation, diaries, carvings, and records revealed a mind obsessed with control and divine purpose. Crane recognized that while the sisters' actions had gone unchecked for years, the evidence preserved their methods with clarity and precision. Their ideology, combining religious conviction with pseudo-scientific observations, had justified systematic cruelty in their own minds. Each entry reinforced the calculated nature of their operations: selection of captives, management of resources, monitoring of health, and recording of outcomes. By the close of the investigation, Crane and the marshals had mapped the entire known tunnel network. Chambers used for captivity, rooms for observation, areas for child confinement, and burial spaces were catalogued in detail. Harkins' medical reports complemented the physical evidence, providing documentation of the survivors' condition and potential indicators of long-term care requirements. The Holloway homestead itself was marked for destruction, as local residents, horrified by the revelations, sought to erase the physical remnants of the sisters' work. Fires consumed the cabin, outbuildings, and the carved doors in the hillside. Locals gathered to witness the destruction, seeking not merely retribution, but symbolic cleansing of the hollow, where darkness had flourished. Crane recorded these events, understanding that the eradication of physical structures could not entirely erase the legacy of the Holloway's crimes. The mountains themselves, unchanged and indifferent, continued to bear witness. Even as the property was reduced to ash, Crane's thoughts returned to the surviving children. Their existence, testimony to prolonged abuse, and inability to fully integrate into society, were enduring reminders of the human cost. Harkins' journals and Crane's meticulous records would preserve the case for posterity, informing law enforcement procedures, social services, and medical understanding. Yet the emotional and psychological toll of the Holloway's acts would persist, a shadow over the community and a cautionary testament to the dangers of isolation, fanaticism, and unchecked power. In the weeks following the Holloway raid, the formal investigation extended beyond immediate evidence collection into more painstaking analysis of the sisters' records, implements, and the subterranean architecture. Crane and Dr. Harkins, alongside a small team of federal clerks and marshals, remained at the edge of the Buffalo River Hollow, poring over each fragment left in the wake of the fire. The ash and rubble preserved the faint outlines of rooms and doorways, and Crane's team meticulously measured, sketched, and catalogued the remnants, aware that even in destruction, the mountains retained silent testimony of years of meticulous horror. Harkins began his examination of the surviving diaries and etched notations recovered from the tunnels. Prudence Holloway's journal, preserved in soot, stained pages sewn into quilts and hidden linings, offered detailed accounts of what she referred to as her divine experiment. Entries described capture dates, physical attributes of men, and instructions for confinement and observation of both adults and children. The meticulous nature of these records suggested years of patient calculation, each victim assessed for suitability in terms of physical strength, cognitive capacity, and perceived moral fortitude. Crane noted that the sisters had employed a disturbingly methodical approach, blending religious rhetoric with rudimentary scientific observation, a pseudo-empirical cataloging that blurred the line between devout zeal and methodical sadism. Analysis of the diaries revealed a chronology of abductions and confinement spanning at least 3 years. The earliest entries, from late 1896, recorded the capture of a traveling trapper, noting his proficiency with firearms and his robust health. Subsequent records documented similar men, selected for their resilience, intelligence, and compliance, or, more precisely, for traits the Holloways believed essential to their plan of preserving a pure mountain bloodline. Every detail, from eye color to bone structure, was documented. The sisters had tracked each man's behavior under duress, maintaining precise records of obedience, defiance, and physical deterioration. These writings, meticulous in form yet horrifying in content, illustrated a systematic approach to captivity that was both organized and fanatical. Crane observed that the underground tunnels had been designed with remarkable ingenuity. While crude in construction, the network demonstrated clear planning. Chambers were sized to restrict movement, niches and alcoves provided minimal living space, and certain corridors were deliberately narrow, forcing men to stoop or move laterally, limiting escape potential. Drainage channels, improvised ventilation shafts, and subtle recesses indicated the sisters' attention to environmental control. Harkins theorized that the placement of chains, bedding, and feeding areas had been arranged to maximize the effects of isolation and physical debilitation, while minimizing the risk of successful resistance or escape. The medical examination of the surviving children revealed additional evidence of the Holloway's practices. Harkins' detailed notes described emaciation, untreated wounds, stunted growth, and impaired motor development. Psychological observations were equally troubling. The children exhibited extreme fear of light and space, minimal language acquisition, and hypervigilance. Even after removal from the tunnels, they recoiled from human contact and were prone to sudden panic. Harkins' assessment concluded that while some physical recovery was possible, the psychological damage was likely permanent. The children had been conditioned for darkness, isolation, and strict obedience, a cruel experiment in environmental control with lasting effects. As the federal team continued its examination, Crane uncovered remnants of what appeared to have been an experimental breeding chamber. Implements of measurement, rudimentary charts etched in stone, and crude notations suggested the sisters had been attempting to manage reproduction among their captives. Although no living adult subjects remained, the evidence indicated a systematic approach monitoring pregnancies, tracking infant survival, and recording physical and behavioral traits. Crane understood that the sisters' pseudo-scientific methods were motivated by a combination of religious zeal and obsession with heredity, producing a calculated cruelty that was both methodical and sustained. The local community remained deeply unsettled. Word of the Holloway's crimes had spread beyond Newton County, sparking conversations in distant towns, along the Buffalo River, and as far as Harrison. Families who had lost men to unexplained disappearances now recognized the connections, confirming identities through the recovered remains and personal effects. The scale of the Holloway's operations, the calculated nature of their confinement, and the evidence of breeding programs challenged prevailing assumptions about morality, isolation, and human capability. Crane received letters from other counties, detailing similar patterns of disappearance, prompting concern that the Holloways were not an isolated case, but a symptom of broader vulnerabilities inherent to remote wilderness regions. In the aftermath of the raid, Crane and Harkins also examined the structural modifications made to the Holloway homestead. The carved doors in the hillside, concealed beneath the cabin's facade, were measured and documented before being sealed with rubble and earth by the local community. Observers noted that the sisters had relied heavily on the natural topography to maintain secrecy. Steep inclines, dense underbrush, and the valley's inaccessibility all contributed to the prolonged undetected operation. Crane's reports emphasized the importance of geographic isolation as both tool and accomplice in the Holloway's crimes, noting that even minor features of the landscape had been exploited to achieve complete concealment. Beyond structural and documentary analysis, the investigation included attempts to understand the sisters' psychological framework. The diaries and notations revealed a persistent invocation of Scripture, particularly passages emphasizing multiplication, fruitfulness, and obedience to divine command. Crane and Harkins noted that the Holloways had combined these religious motifs with careful observation and recording of human behavior, producing a blend of fanaticism and systematic cruelty. Prudence Holloway, in particular, displayed a meticulous obsession with documenting traits she deemed desirable, while Verity's actions suggested a capacity for violence in the enforcement of these principles. Together, they had maintained a regime of confinement, coercion, and manipulation for years without detection. The discovery of burial chambers confirmed the systematic nature of the crimes. Crane and his team cataloged 26 adult men, noting condition, distinguishing features, and personal effects. Among them were trappers from Missouri, Tennessee, and Germany, all previously reported missing. Identification relied on artifacts, clothing, and skeletal characteristics. The documentation of these burials, while constrained by the limitations of 1899 forensic methods, provided clear evidence of sustained captivity, abuse, and eventual death. Crane's records emphasized the ordered nature of disposal, noting patterns in placement and sequence that reflected the sisters' ongoing management of both living and deceased subjects. Dr. Harkins' medical observations further corroborated the Holloways' systematic cruelty. The children's severe developmental delays, the adult remains evidence of restraint, and signs of malnutrition all indicated a carefully maintained environment of deprivation and control. Harkins' notes highlighted the long-term consequences of the sisters' methods, particularly for the surviving children. Lifelong impairments in cognition, mobility, and emotional stability. The medical team's work underscored the degree to which the Holloways had manipulated both environment and human biology to achieve their goals. Community response remained intense and deliberate. Local families, informed of the findings, destroyed the Holloway homestead and surrounding outbuildings, burning all evidence of the sisters' presence. The carved doors were filled with rubble, and the surrounding land was marked as cursed. Crane documented these actions, noting that the destruction served both as symbolic cleansing and as practical prevention of further access to the subterranean network. The mountains themselves remained unchanged, silent witnesses to years of hidden cruelty. By the end of October 1899, the investigation had produced a comprehensive report detailing the Holloways' operations, the physical evidence of captivity, the psychological and medical impact on survivors, and the social and geographic factors that had facilitated prolonged concealment. Crane's meticulous record keeping established a template for rural crime investigation, emphasizing the importance of careful documentation, methodical mapping, and cross-referencing of physical evidence with survivor testimony. The report would inform law enforcement practices in isolated regions for decades, highlighting both the vulnerabilities and responsibilities inherent in remote communities. Even as the investigation concluded, lingering questions persisted. The network of tunnels, the surviving children's condition, and the breadth of the sisters' documentation suggested that the Holloways' obsession had been sustained over years, with precision and patience that defied simple explanation. Crane recognized that the case was more than an anomaly of geography or personality. It represented a collision of isolation, fanaticism, and human ingenuity used to inflict harm. The investigation preserved the evidence, but it could not erase the impact on the community, the families of the deceased, or the fragile survivors. As autumn deepened into late 1899, the Holloway case extended beyond immediate rescue and forensic documentation into a more analytical phase. Deputy Elias Crane, now back in Harrison, Arkansas, devoted himself to referencing the sisters' diaries, the surviving children's testimonies, and the accounts of recovered trappers. He had begun to recognize a pattern in the sisters' selection of victims, one that suggested careful surveillance and prior knowledge of the men's skills, resilience, and physical attributes. This discovery added a chilling dimension to the case. The Holloways had not merely responded opportunistically, but had actively sought individuals who fit specific criteria. Dr. Leonard Harkins continued his work with the children in Little Rock. He documented minor progress in their physical recovery, but became increasingly concerned about the long-term effects of years spent in darkness and deprivation. The eldest child, a girl of roughly 7, displayed some awareness of objects, rudimentary responses to speech, and limited mobility. Yet her gestures remained primitive, her vocalizations limited to single syllables or whimpers. The two younger children, barely able to lift themselves without assistance, exhibited almost no coherent response to human presence beyond fear. Harkins recorded each interaction in precise detail, noting both physical and psychological markers. The children's continued trauma reinforced the systematic cruelty that had been inflicted over the years, demonstrating that even a single day in the Holloway tunnels could have devastating, long-term consequences. Meanwhile, Crane's examination of the sisters' operational methods deepened. Entries in Prudence Holloway's diary combined with markings discovered on the tunnel walls, suggested an almost scientific approach to confinement. Certain men were described as more productive, a term the sisters used to denote those most suitable for breeding. Crane noted with grim clarity that the sisters had meticulously documented not only physical measurements, but behavioral traits, responsiveness to commands, resistance to fatigue, and compliance under stress. Every aspect of human behavior was scrutinized and recorded, and deviations were met with punishment or prolonged deprivation. It became evident that the Holloways had created a controlled microcosm within the mountain, a laboratory of human subjects operating under strict and brutal constraints. Crane's team also revisited the remains of the burial chambers. Although the local community had sealed the tunnels and burned surface structures, remnants of the underground system remained accessible. Measurements of skeletal remains, when cross-referenced with diary entries, suggested precise chronological tracking of deaths. Some individuals had been kept alive for months, their physical decline meticulously documented. Others had been allowed to perish quickly, after being deemed unsuitable for the sisters' plans. These findings revealed not only methodical cruelty, but also an underlying obsession with maintaining order, control, and adherence to their ideological vision. Harkins' analysis extended to the implications of hereditary selection. He recorded observations on the surviving children, noting their physical anomalies, diminished muscle tone, and delayed reflexes, likely resulting from both isolation and nutritional deprivation. The eldest child exhibited subtle skeletal irregularities, perhaps the result of constrained movement within narrow subterranean corridors. Harkins speculated that the sisters' fixation on purity and strength had led them to select traits among their captives, attempting to engineer desired outcomes in subsequent generations. These attempts, conducted without medical understanding or ethical consideration, represented a perverse blend of religious fervor and experimental pseudoscience. Beyond the medical and forensic dimensions, Crane sought to understand the social mechanisms that had allowed the Holloways to operate undetected for years. Interviews with neighboring families revealed a culture of avoidance, superstition, and tacit compliance with the mountain's unyielding conditions. Locals described the Holloways as reclusive and stern, their presence acknowledged but rarely approached. The sisters' reputation for eccentricity, combined with the treacherous terrain and the natural concealment of their property, had created a buffer of isolation sufficient to mask criminal activity. Crane concluded that geography, social detachment, and fear had contributed as much to the sisters' longevity as their own meticulous planning. One discovery provided a particularly stark insight into the Holloways' methods. Remnants of rudimentary medical implements. Small knives, blunt metal tools, and jars containing herbs and chemicals were recovered from alcoves near the burial and confinement chambers. Harkins examined these implements and concluded that the sisters had attempted basic interventions, treating minor wounds or managing pregnancies, but with only minimal understanding of human anatomy. Their procedures, while not wholly medical, reflected a disturbing attention to controlling the physical states of their captives. Every wound, illness, and infant death had been noted, each deviation recorded in diaries or on walls. This level of observation, combined with an ideological justification, marked the Holloways as uniquely methodical in their cruelty. Crane also uncovered evidence suggesting the sisters' broader knowledge of their victims' habits. Diary entries indicated that the Holloways had studied the rhythms of men traveling along the Buffalo River, noting the timing of supply deliveries, seasonal hunting patterns, and even personal idiosyncrasies. Men were approached under the guise of trade or hospitality, with initial trust, building followed by abduction. The diaries revealed repeated phrasing emphasizing divine purpose, purity of blood, and obedience to providence, linking methodical observation directly to their religious worldview. Crane recorded these passages verbatim, understanding their significance in establishing motive and premeditation. Federal authorities, informed of these findings, expressed astonishment at the systematic nature of the Holloway's operations. Communications emphasized the intersection of isolation, geographic advantage, religious conviction, and pseudo-scientific methodology. Officials recognized that while the mountain terrain had provided concealment, the sisters' deliberate record-keeping, architectural planning, and manipulative tactics were equally critical to the longevity of their crimes. The Holloway case became a reference point for later investigations, demonstrating the importance of examining both environmental and human factors in complex criminal activity. By December 1899, the Holloway investigation had shifted focus to long-term containment and recovery. The surviving children remained under Harkins' supervision in Little Rock, where attempts at rehabilitation proceeded cautiously. Psychological and social interventions were introduced, though limited by contemporary understanding and resources. Crane continued correspondence with families of the deceased, providing updates on identification, burial, and ongoing care for the children. The emotional weight of the case pressed heavily upon him. Despite his methodical approach, the human cost was undeniable. Analytical work extended to mapping the sisters' operational framework. Crane and his clerks created diagrams illustrating the tunnel's structure, indicating which chambers had been used for confinement, observation, or burial. Patterns in the diaries and wall markings were overlaid on these diagrams, producing a detailed reconstruction of the Holloway's methodology. This work revealed a coherent system, entry and exit points, surveillance patterns, controlled feeding schedules, and deliberate environmental manipulation. Crane recognized that the sisters' operation, while criminal in nature, reflected an applied understanding of control, observation, and behavioral conditioning. Even after the tunnels were sealed, questions remained. Were other similar operations hidden within the mountains, or was the Holloway case a unique convergence of geography, ideology, and opportunity? Crane and Harkins debated this frequently, aware that the isolation of the Ozark terrain and the persistence of human secrecy left open the possibility of further, undiscovered horrors. The surviving children, though a focus of medical attention, were also living proof of the Holloway's ability to manipulate human life in ways that were almost unimaginable. In January 1900, Crane prepared a final supplemental report, summarizing the months of investigation. He included exhaustive documentation, skeletal analyses, diagrams of tunnel networks, diary excerpts, medical observations, and detailed records of the surviving children's conditions. The report emphasized the methodical nature of the Holloway's operations, the systematic selection and abuse of victims, and the interplay of geography, isolation, and ideology that had permitted these acts to persist. Crane concluded with a sober reflection on human capability for cruelty, noting that even in the most remote wilderness, deliberate intent could produce horrors previously thought confined to fiction or folklore. Harkins' medical reports were appended to Crane's report, providing clinical context for the children's condition and the long-term consequences of subterranean deprivation. Harkins stressed that while physical rehabilitation could address malnutrition and minor injuries, the psychological damage was permanent and profound. The reports included recommendations for continued observation, restricted exposure to overwhelming stimuli, and careful social integration to prevent further trauma. These measures, while limited by the period's medical knowledge, reflected the seriousness with which authorities approached the aftermath of the Holloway's crimes. By the close of winter 1899, the Holloway case had achieved a degree of closure. The sisters were dead, surviving children were in protective care, and the evidence had been catalogued and reported. Yet the case's resonance persisted. Families mourned the loss of their sons. Neighbors grappled with the realization that such atrocities had occurred within walking distance of their homes, and federal authorities recognized the potential for similar abuses in other isolated regions. Crane and Harkins understood that the Holloway Hollow, now sealed and smothered beneath rubble, remained a silent testament to human cruelty and obsession. In the early months of 1900, following the initial closure of the Holloway investigation, Deputy Elias Crane turned his attention to the broader implications of the sisters' operations. Though Prudence and Verity Holloway were deceased, and the surviving children placed under protective custody, Crane recognized that the meticulous documentation recovered from the tunnels held more than merely evidentiary value. It offered a window into a mindset shaped by isolation, fanaticism, and obsession with hereditary control. The diaries, etched not only in paper but in stone, quilt linings, and sporadic wall markings, chronicled years of calculated cruelty and revealed operational methods that were astonishing in their precision. The Holloways had not relied solely on coercion and physical restraint. They had created a system of observation designed to study human behavior under extreme conditions. The diaries detailed daily routine schedules for feeding and water rationing, movement restrictions, and the enforced periods of solitude imposed on individual captives. These routines were codified, often accompanied by scriptural annotations, emphasizing obedience, divine purpose, and the necessity of endurance for the greater good. Crane observed that the sisters' combination of religious dogma with methodical record keeping resembled an early form of experimental social control, one conducted entirely outside the bounds of contemporary morality or legal oversight. Medical analysis conducted by Dr. Leonard Harkins in Little Rock further corroborated the Holloways' deliberate manipulation. The surviving eldest child exhibited skeletal deformities, reduced muscle development, and impaired coordination consistent with prolonged confinement in narrow tunnels. Harkins noted that the child's cognitive development, while showing minor improvements in communication and object recognition, remained profoundly delayed, illustrating the long-term psychological impact of environmental deprivation. The two younger children, essentially non-verbal and severely weakened, bore the cumulative effects of starvation, neglect, and sensory deprivation. Harkins' notes suggested that the Holloways' focus on control extended beyond physical restraint to a subtle, enduring, and manipulation of mental and emotional development. Crane and his clerks undertook a systematic cataloging of the sisters' operational techniques. The Holloways' selection criteria for captives became clear. Men were chosen based on their physical resilience, skill in wilderness survival, and adherence to social proprieties, which the sisters interpreted as moral fitness. Those deemed unfit were either confined for shorter periods or subjected to conditions leading rapidly to death. Diary entries detailed such decisions, often accompanied by religious rationalization. One passage described a man who failed in obedience and endurance, and was removed from the program with no apparent emotional reservation, noted only with the date, his measurements, and a brief reference to scripture. The precision of these observations indicated both methodical planning and unwavering adherence to their self-appointed mission. Crane's mapping of the Holloway tunnels revealed an architectural sophistication previously unappreciated. The chambers were constructed to maximize surveillance and limit resistance. Narrow corridors restricted movement. Small alcoves permitted temporary concealment, but prevented meaningful escape, and feeding and water areas were strategically placed to enforce dependence. Chain anchors were embedded into rock walls at carefully measured intervals, and certain passageways were deliberately uneven, forcing captives into awkward positions that minimized their capacity for coordinated movement. Even ventilation was controlled, likely to prevent prolonged exposure to fresh air that might invigorate resistance. Crane recorded these findings with careful diagrams, annotating every junction, alcove, and measured distance, understanding that such detail would be essential in reconstructing the sisters' methodology. The diaries further revealed that the Holloways had experimented with rudimentary reproductive management. References to pregnancies, births, and infant deaths were scattered throughout the entries, marked with dates, physical measurements, and observations about temperament or health. The sisters' terminology, phrases such as vessels of providence, inheritance of purity, and obedience to creation, linked these observations explicitly to a religious framework, demonstrating the fusion of ideology and practice that defined their crimes. Crane noted that this pseudo-scientific approach, while ethically abhorrent, reflected a consistent logic within the sisters' worldviews. Each act, no matter how brutal, was justified as part of a divine experiment to preserve and enhance the mountain bloodline. Further investigation into the diaries and wall markings suggested that the Holloways had maintained a broader understanding of local networks, exploiting both human and environmental factors to conceal their activities. They tracked the movements of trappers, noted the arrival of peddlers and supply wagons, and even documented natural hazards to predict when men might travel through their territory. By combining environmental intelligence with careful observation of human behavior, the sisters had created a system of control extending beyond the tunnels themselves. Victims were often isolated long before entering the subterranean chambers, ensuring compliance and minimizing the risk of immediate detection. Crane also revisited correspondence and family reports from the missing men. Letters from relatives revealed the slow accumulation of unease as men failed to return from hunting or trapping expeditions. While some initially attributed absences to accidents or voluntary departures, the pattern of disappearances became increasingly apparent. Crane cross-referenced dates and locations with Holloway diaries, confirming that men had been selected and abducted according to a deliberate schedule. This correlation reinforced the conclusion that the Holloways' operation was premeditated and methodical, sustained over years by a combination of planning, geographic isolation, and psychological manipulation. As winter approached, federal authorities became increasingly involved in evaluating the broader implications of the Holloway case. Officials emphasized the need for standardized reporting in remote regions, particularly for cases involving repeated disappearances and the potential for systemic abuse. Crane's detailed records became a model for subsequent investigations, demonstrating the value of combining direct observation, survivor testimony, and forensic analysis. The Holloway case, horrifying in its particulars, offered crucial lessons about the interplay of isolation, ideology, and methodical cruelty. Harkins' ongoing medical supervision of the surviving children provided further insights into the sisters' methods. Observations revealed that even minor changes in environment produced significant distress, indicating the depth of psychological conditioning. The eldest child, though able to respond to basic stimuli, continued to show fear responses associated with light, open spaces, and unexpected human contact. Harkins interpreted these reactions as evidence of prolonged trauma, noting that the sisters had effectively conditioned the children to fear the external world, reinforcing dependence on captivity and control. Crane also analyzed the Holloways' use of pseudo-scientific measurement. Diary entries recorded height, weight, limb proportions, and responses to specific tasks, suggesting that the sisters sought to produce an idealized physical specimen. Behavioral compliance was similarly quantified, with detailed notes on obedience, endurance, and reaction to deprivation. While these records reflected no genuine understanding of genetics or physiology, they demonstrated a consistent, empirical approach to human selection within the sisters' ideological framework. Crane emphasized this in his reports, recognizing that the Holloways' meticulous record-keeping had enabled them to maintain control over victims for extended periods, translating fanaticism into observable, repeatable patterns of human behavior. In addition to structural and operational analysis, Crane examined the sisters' ideological justifications. The diaries were replete with scriptural citations, often from the Old Testament, used to rationalize confinement, coercion, and the management of life and death. Passages emphasizing obedience, multiplication, and moral vigilance were repeatedly invoked, demonstrating that the Holloway's actions were rooted in a sustained, self-reinforcing belief system. Crane noted that while religious justification did not mitigate culpability, understanding the ideological framework was essential to comprehending the calculated nature of the sisters' cruelty. By early spring 1900, the Holloway case had evolved from an emergency rescue into a comprehensive study of methodical human abuse under isolation. Crane's reports emphasized the intersection of geography, ideology, and operational precision, detailing the ways in which the sisters had exploited environmental and social factors to sustain years of captivity. Harkins' medical appendices documented the enduring consequences for surviving children, offering clinical insight into the long-term effects of deprivation, trauma, and enforced isolation. Together, these documents formed an unprecedented record of both human cruelty and resilience in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Even as formal investigations concluded, questions persisted. Could other regions harbor similar operations? How many disappeared men had never been discovered? The mountains themselves remained silent, their slopes and hollows concealing the past and offering no assurance that such horrors were confined to a single location. Crane and Harkins recognized the limitations of their understanding. While evidence had been preserved and documented, the human capacity for secrecy, fanaticism, and methodological cruelty could never be fully quantified or contained. The Holloway tunnels, now sealed beneath rubble, served as both a physical and symbolic testament to the extremes of human obsession. Every measurement, diary entry, and skeletal remnant revealed a carefully maintained system of control and observation. The surviving children, fragile and profoundly traumatized, bore witness to the Holloway's perverse vision of purity and obedience. Crane, Harkins, and the federal team understood that while the sisters' lives had ended, their methodology and the consequences of their actions would persist, both in the historical record and in the lives of those who survived. By mid-1900, Deputy Elias Crane and Dr. Leonard Harkins had reached the limits of what archival reconstruction and medical observation could reveal, yet the unanswered questions gnawed persistently at both men. Among the remnants of the Holloway tunnels, sealed beneath rubble and ash, lay details that could only be inferred, not directly observed. It was this ambiguity, the interplay between recorded fact and probable circumstance, that gave the case its enduring weight, for it suggested the presence of horrors still unaccounted for, shadows of the sisters' work stretching beyond immediate comprehension. Crane returned once more to the region in late spring, intent on surveying the surrounding terrain and confirming that no additional chambers or subterranean passages had been overlooked. Guided by local trappers and by his own meticulously constructed maps, he ascended the ridges and explored the hollows adjacent to the Holloway property. The mountains were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant crow, yet Crane felt an almost palpable presence, a residue of human intent that seemed to linger in the rocks themselves. As he traced contours of the earth, he noted depressions, overgrown mounds, and hollowed spaces that suggested previous digging or construction. Though the main tunnels had been sealed, subtle anomalies in the terrain implied that the sisters' influence had been more extensive than previously understood. A week into his survey, Crane discovered an indentation along a ridge approximately half a mile from the original homestead. It was a narrow slit in the limestone, partially obscured by brush. That suggested deliberate concealment. Using a measuring rod, he noted that the space was too small for a grown man to navigate upright, but consistent with dimensions recorded in the Holloway diaries for secondary chambers or escape passages. Crane marked the location carefully, planning to return with a team capable of excavation, though he was mindful of the logistical difficulties. Even after the official federal raid, the mountains retained a stubborn resistance to inspection, a reminder that natural isolation had long been the sisters' greatest ally. Meanwhile, Dr. Harkins' work with the surviving eldest child intensified. The girl's speech remained rudimentary, but she exhibited intermittent recognition of the doctor, responding to his voice with small gestures. Harkins recorded these incremental gains with both hope and apprehension. He noted that, while her body was stabilizing and her physical health improving, the mental imprint of the tunnels, the constant darkness, the enforced dependence, the irregular rhythm of days and nights, remained. The child recoiled from sudden light, made frantic attempts to return to enclosed spaces, and displayed pronounced startled responses when approached. Harkins interpreted these as evidence of both adaptive survival behaviors and deep-seated trauma. The tunnels had conditioned not only fear but a profound disorientation, a cognitive mapping of the world that was defined entirely by subterranean confines. Crane's return to Harrison revealed new layers in the sisters' documentation. Examination of remaining diary fragments, combined with surviving wall markings and scattered artifacts, demonstrated that Prudence and Verity Holloway had engaged in repeated experiments on human endurance. Men had been subjected to cycles of deprivation, limited food, minimal water, isolation, followed by periods of forced labor, designed to test physical resilience. Entries detailed observations of muscle fatigue, reaction times, and capacity for obedience, often annotated with biblical references justifying the endurance tests as acts of divine selection. The diaries suggested a chilling logic. The Holloways were not merely captors but experimenters, systematically attempting to measure and modify human behavior according to their ideological vision. Harkins, in parallel, began documenting the physical markers left on the surviving child that directly corresponded to the sisters' operational notes. Skeletal growth anomalies, stunted musculature, and diminished reflexes matched the types of measurements and observations Prudence Holloway had meticulously recorded. Harkins' reports emphasized the deliberate nature of the deprivation, concluding that the tunnels had functioned as a controlled environment, one designed to impose both physical and psychological constraints. The child's incremental responses to stimulation provided limited optimism, but Harkins acknowledged that years of subterranean conditioning were not readily undone. It was during this period that Crane received an anonymous letter, delivered by a courier from an outlying settlement along the Buffalo River. The note, written in hurried, spidery script, suggested that there were others like the Holloways, in neighboring hollows, operating under similar philosophies of purity and divine design. Though lacking specifics, the letter reignited Crane's concern that the Holloway operation might not have been singular. The note's vagueness, combined with the inaccessibility of remote ridges and hollows, underscored the potential for undiscovered crimes. Crane retained the letter for the official record, understanding that even unverified claims had weight when considered in the context of systematic concealment and human depravity. In early June, Crane assembled a small team of local guides and federal marshals to inspect the ridge where the slit had been discovered. Though preliminary, the excavation revealed a short tunnel, approximately 15 feet in length, descending into the limestone. Torchlight illuminated crude markings on the walls, lines etched into rock, numerals corresponding to diary annotations, and fragments of names that matched missing trappers. The team proceeded cautiously, aware that structural instability could result in collapse. Despite the minimal space, evidence of human occupancy, bone fragments, rusted shackles, fragments of clothing, suggested that the Holloway's network had extended farther than the official raid had revealed. Crane documented every detail, recording measurements, sketches, and photographs for federal archives. The psychological weight of discovery was compounded by the tangible sense of the sisters' ideological presence. The etched markings, the careful dimensions, and the remnants of chains communicated an almost sentient attention to control. Crane remarked in his journal that even absent the Holloways themselves, their methodology persisted in the mountains, as though the very terrain had absorbed the rules of captivity, leaving an imprint that human visitors could sense. Federal officials reviewing the documentation echoed his observation. The operational logic of the Holloways had been so thorough that its legacy remained, even in death and absence. During this same period, Harkins observed a striking behavioral response in the eldest child. When exposed to light, she demonstrated reflexive withdrawal, vocalizing sounds interpreted as distress. Yet when presented with a small, enclosed area that approximated the tunnel's dimensions, she exhibited tentative calm, inspecting the space with cautious familiarity. Harkins recorded this in meticulous detail, noting the persistence of learned behaviors and environmental conditioning. The child's responses were not mere fear, but an ingrained cognitive mapping, a haunting reflection of years spent entirely within the Holloways' subterranean microcosm. Crane's continued investigation suggested that the sisters' scope had extended even beyond the immediate homestead. Topographical studies and diary cross-references implied that other hollows, narrow ravines, and limestone fissures may have been used to conceal victims or store supplies. While direct evidence was limited, the consistency of measurements, names, and operational descriptions reinforced the conclusion that Prudence and Verity Holloway had maintained a network of controlled spaces beyond the central tunnels. The discovery of the ridge slit provided tangible proof of this broader reach, intensifying the investigation's sense of urgency. Confronted with these revelations, federal authorities convened a series of consultations in Little Rock. Crane and Harkins presented their findings in exhaustive detail, emphasizing the convergence of geographic isolation, methodological cruelty, and ideological conviction. Officials acknowledged that, while the sisters were deceased, the Holloway operation represented a case study in premeditated, sustained abuse, and in the challenges posed by remote environments. The Holloway case prompted early discussions about coordinated inter-county communication, standardized missing persons reporting, and protocols for investigating complex crimes in difficult terrain. By late June, Crane returned to Harrison to finalize documentation and ensure that all evidence, including diary fragments, skeletal remains, and tunnel measurements, had been catalogued. He remained vigilant for signs of previously undiscovered chambers, conducting systematic sweeps of hollows, ridges, and limestone outcroppings. The labor was slow and physically demanding, but necessary to confirm that the Holloway operation had been contained, and that no additional victims remained in concealment. The work reinforced a sobering truth. The mountains themselves were both witness and accomplice, concealing the Holloway's crimes through decades of dense forest, steep ridges, and inaccessible hollows. Despite the outward completion of the investigation, Crane recorded in his journal that the psychological and cultural impact of the Holloway case persisted. Families mourned their missing men, children carried trauma from captivity, and local communities remained marked by the shadow of prolonged secrecy. Crane reflected on the uncanny precision of the sisters' records and the extent to which ideology, obsession, and isolation could translate into sustained human suffering. He concluded that the Holloway's methodology, while unique in its particulars, offered lessons that transcended the immediate crime, highlighting the intersection of geography, human intent, and systemic cruelty. Even in the quiet aftermath, the Holloway Hollow retained an almost sentient presence. Crane observed subtle patterns in local wildlife behavior, noting that certain valleys remained untraversed by deer or foxes, and birds avoided dense sections of the forest previously used by the sisters. These observations, though anecdotal, reinforced the pervasive imprint of long-term human manipulation on the natural environment. The Holloway's control had extended beyond captive men and children, It had left a lasting, almost atmospheric mark on the mountains themselves. By July of 1900, the full magnitude of the Holloway operation had begun to crystallize. Deputy Elias Crane, along with Dr. Leonard Harkins, realized that the discovery of the Ridge Tunnel and ancillary hollows only partially accounted for the sisters' systematic abuse. While Prudence and Verity Holloway were dead, the meticulous documentation they had left behind suggested a sophistication that went beyond immediate observation. Their methods encompassed surveillance, captivity, and experimentation in a manner that was both procedural and ideologically rigorous. The journals and wall markings had revealed 28 confirmed victims, but Crane feared that others may have been taken, their disappearances unrecorded or attributed to accident. A week-long expedition to examine the surrounding hollows confirmed Crane's worst suspicions. Remote valleys, concealed behind thickets of laurel and oak, showed evidence of human modification, flattened bedding areas, faint depressions suggesting storage, and the occasional rusted artifact consistent with chain hardware. While none contained human remains, the proximity to recorded Holloway tunnels suggested deliberate use for transit or temporary confinement. Crane meticulously documented these features, annotating measurements, photographs, and sketches. The scale of the sisters' reach became increasingly clear. They had not relied on a single cell or cavern, but rather a network of concealed spaces designed to maintain control, observation, and isolation. Dr. Harkins, meanwhile, continued his work with the eldest surviving child. Progress in speech was slow, but there were intermittent signs of cognition beyond simple survival instincts. When prompted with familiar shapes or vocal cues, the child displayed recognition, though it was accompanied by profound fear responses. Harkins observed that the child's perception of open space remained conditioned by years of confinement, a psychological imprint that was almost impossible to reverse. Her physical frailty mirrored her mental state. Years in darkness had stunted growth, weakened musculature, and limited her capacity to adapt to ordinary human environments. Harkins concluded that the Holloway's methodology had imposed both immediate suffering and long-lasting developmental impairment. Crane's attention turned to reconstructing the sisters' selection and breeding system in detail. Through careful cross-referencing of diary entries, skeletal remains, and survivor testimony, he determined that Prudence and Verity had employed a combination of physical, behavioral, and ideological criteria to select captives. Men were evaluated for endurance, physical strength, obedience, and social propriety. Those deemed suitable were confined in tunnels for extended periods, while those failing to meet standards were released, relocated, or executed. The diaries included repeated observations about compliance under deprivation, measured reactions to light and sound, and the capacity to follow directive instructions, all noted with dates, measurements, and biblical references. Crane noted that, while the sisters' understanding of physiology or heredity was rudimentary, their empirical approach demonstrated a calculated, procedural cruelty designed to shape both body and behavior. The psychological weight of the investigation became apparent during Crane's review of the Holloway diaries. Entries described the births of children in captivity, their health, and the frequency of infant mortality. One fragment recorded, "Child of worthy vessel survives, but one passes. The Lord's providence guides the weak to dust. The strong remain." Such passages suggested not only religious rationalization, but a persistent, systematic attention to reproductive control, reinforced by the sisters' own ideological obsession with purity. Crane reflected on the difficulty of reconciling procedural clarity with moral horror. The Holloways had operated according to rules, yet those rules were antithetical to the most basic human decencies. Federal authorities grew increasingly concerned about the broader implications. In meetings convened in Little Rock, Crane and Harkins emphasized the necessity of regional vigilance, recognizing that extreme isolation could harbor other operations, particularly in hollows and valleys accessible only by narrow trails. Though no further cases had been reported, the precision of the Holloway network, combined with the discovery of auxiliary tunnels, suggested that similar methods could be employed elsewhere. Federal marshals and local authorities were urged to standardize reporting, maintain consistent communication, and document anomalies rigorously, laying groundwork for protocols that would influence investigations for decades to come. A critical breakthrough occurred when Crane revisited the main Holloway homestead site with a structural engineer. Beneath the rubble of the burned cabin, careful probing revealed faint traces of post and beam construction extending beyond the original tunnel entrance. These remnants suggested the existence of additional chambers, previously concealed by rock and soil. Crane noted that the main subterranean system had been deliberately designed to appear complete and isolated, yet the engineering indicated foresight. Additional storage, temporary confinement, or observation chambers had been integrated into the rockwork. Though no human remains were present, the spatial layout confirmed that Prudence and Verity had planned for prolonged operations, including contingencies for expansion and further control. Dr. Harkins' observations of the surviving child revealed a curious but disturbing pattern. When presented with dim lighting approximating the tunnel's interior, she displayed both calm and orientation, moving with measured steps and examining the space with familiarity. When returned to open daylight, she recoiled violently, vocalizing distress and attempting retreat. Harkins concluded that the child's spatial cognition remained dominated by the tunnel's architecture, a psychological imprint that suggested the Holloways had engineered not only physical restraint, but enduring cognitive conditioning. The experiments, though morally indefensible, had achieved a measure of methodological consistency. Confinement, deprivation, and observation produced predictable physiological and behavioral effects. In early August, Crane's team conducted the final sweep of adjacent hollows and ridges. Careful examination of limestone fissures, ledges, and concealed depressions revealed no additional human remains, but confirmed patterns of usage consistent with Holloway methodology. The debris of occupation, rusted shackles, bone fragments, and fragments of clothing indicated that these areas had been employed as transit points or temporary holding locations. Crane's annotations detailed every dimension, every artifact, and every topographical feature. The network of controlled spaces, once abstract in diary form, now emerged as a tangible, physical reality, a lattice of subterranean confinement, carefully integrated with the natural geography of the mountains. The culmination of these investigations underscored a profound reality. The Holloway's operation had been both localized and methodically expansive. While the immediate tunnels and central homestead had been neutralized, the principles of their methodology, the use of isolation, structured deprivation, and ideological conditioning, could, in theory, be replicated elsewhere. Crane's reports emphasized that geography alone had enabled the sisters' prolonged operations, and that isolation, combined with rigorous documentation and planning, could perpetuate human suffering in ways that eluded conventional oversight. Harkins, in collaboration with Crane, produced a detailed report summarizing both the physiological and psychological impact on the surviving child. The document cataloged growth deficiencies, developmental delays, and persistent conditioned responses, alongside anecdotal observations of resilience and partial cognitive recovery. The report concluded that while immediate intervention could stabilize health and prevent further deterioration, the child's formative years had been irreversibly shaped by captivity and deprivation. These findings reinforced the moral and scientific significance of the Holloway case. Extreme isolation and methodical abuse produced outcomes both measurable and deeply disturbing. As the investigation drew to a close, Crane returned once more to the main Holloway site. The burned remnants of the cabin, the sealed tunnels, and the surrounding ridges had become a landscape of memory and inference. While the physical presence of Prudence and Verity Holloway was gone, their operational signature remained embedded in the terrain, the artifacts, and the psychological residues of survivors. Crane reflected in his journal that the mountains themselves had absorbed the structure of captivity, leaving behind an imprint of human cruelty that would persist long after the perpetrators' deaths. The conclusion of the case did not bring resolution in the conventional sense. Families mourned the missing men, the surviving child faced a lifetime shaped by trauma, and the mountains retained their secrets. Yet the meticulous documentation, the preserved diaries, and the skeletal evidence provided a comprehensive record of both methodology and consequence. Federal authorities formally closed the case in late September 1900, noting in their report that the Holloway operation represented an unprecedented example of organized, ideologically motivated human abuse, conducted in isolation with careful attention to surveillance, measurement, and control. Even in the apparent closure, unease lingered. Crane and Harkins observed that the mountains, dense forests, steep ridges, and hidden hollows could conceal operations, yet unrecorded. The legacy of the Holloway's methods, precise, systematic, and ideologically reinforced, offered a haunting reminder of the potential for cruelty to thrive where oversight could not reach. Though Prudence and Verity were dead, the investigative record made clear that the principles they employed, control, observation, and methodological enforcement of ideology, were not unique to their hollow and might, somewhere else, manifest again. By autumn of 1900, the Holloway Hollow had been formally sealed and catalogued, its horrors documented with painstaking precision by Deputy Elias Crane, Dr. Leonard Harkins, and federal authorities. Yet the physical closure of tunnels, the burning of cabins, and the recovery of skeletal remains could not erase the psychological and social reverberations left in the mountains. Locals spoke of the Holloways in hushed tones, avoiding the valleys and ridges where once human suffering had been meticulously orchestrated. Children were warned not to stray too far, and even seasoned trappers observed subtle precautions, mindful of terrain that had long concealed unspeakable cruelty. In the months that followed, Crane and Harkins continued to reconcile the tangible evidence with the intangible residue of horror, their journals reflecting both professional rigor and profound moral disturbance. The surviving eldest child, who had been placed in a specialized orphanage in Little Rock, remained fragile and wary of human contact. Dr. Harkins' treatments improved her health, but her behavior, retreat into corners, avoidance of open spaces, and startled responses to sudden light or sound, revealed the depth of conditioning imposed by Prudence and Verity Holloway. Harkins recorded daily observations, noting the slow progression of speech and recognition. She learned to feed herself, respond to simple instructions, and occasionally mimic words spoken by the doctor, but her cognition remained tethered to the subterranean architecture she had known, her internal world shaped by darkness and confinement. Attempts to integrate her into normal society met repeated obstacles, as social interaction beyond the controlled environment of the orphanage produced panic and withdrawal. Crane, meanwhile, returned periodically to the Holloway Hollow to confirm that the tunnels remained securely sealed, and to investigate ancillary hollows and ridges for evidence of overlooked chambers. His surveys revealed minor depressions, faint markings, and rusted hardware indicative of temporary usage, yet nothing suggesting additional victims. Every observation was meticulously documented, photographs, sketches, and measurements recorded in ledger after ledger, forming a comprehensive archive intended to prevent future oversight. Despite the closure, Crane noted a persistent unease. The sense that the mountains themselves retained the imprint of systematic cruelty, an almost sentient memory embedded in rock, soil, and forest canopy. The official federal report, finalized in November 1900, provided a detailed account of the Holloway's operations. 28 victims were confirmed, ranging from adult men to infants born in captivity. skeletal remains revealed evidence of prolonged restraint, malnutrition, and injury. Diary fragments documented behavioral observation, forced reproduction, and a systematized methodology of captivity. The Holloway's ideological framework, an obsession with purity, divine mandate, and selective breeding, was meticulously recorded alongside procedural notes and maps. The report emphasized the operational sophistication of the sisters, highlighting the intersection of geography, isolation, and methodical cruelty in enabling prolonged abuse. Communities surrounding the Holloway property responded with collective action. Within weeks of the federal raid, locals returned to the hollow to destroy any remaining evidence. The main cabin, outbuildings, and wooden doors concealing tunnel entrances were reduced to ash, while rubble and earth filled depressions to seal potential access. This destruction was both practical and symbolic, a form of communal exorcism aimed at erasing the tangible presence of the Holloway's terror. Crane noted that while physical traces could be removed, the psychological residue, fear, trauma, and suspicion remained. Families mourned missing men, speculated about the fate of children, and avoided valleys and hollows once traversed by the sisters, perpetuating a culture of caution that would persist for decades. Dr. Harkins' treatment of the surviving child progressed incrementally. By late 1900, she could speak rudimentary sentences, recognize familiar individuals, and perform simple tasks independently. Yet her engagement with the broader world remained limited. Exposure to sunlight produced distressing reactions, and large spaces evoked panic. Harkins noted that her internal perception of reality remained fundamentally shaped by years of confinement and deprivation. Even small signs of autonomy, turning to watch the sun rise, extending a hand to touch leaves or soil, were accompanied by hesitation, indicating both curiosity and fear. The child's fragile existence embodied the long-term human consequences of the Holloway's ideology, survival coupled with enduring cognitive, physical, and emotional impairment. Crane's final field assessments reinforced the sense of totality regarding the Holloway network. Measurements of tunnels, chambers, and auxiliary hollows corresponded with diary entries, confirming both the deliberate scale and operational sophistication of the sisters' system. Cross-referencing skeletal remains with diary records verified 28 victims, and the surviving child's testimony, though rudimentary, corroborated key details. The investigation concluded that while the Holloway's physical operation had been neutralized, the principles underpinning their methodology, ideological obsession, systematic control, and manipulation of human behavior, remained a potential hazard wherever isolation, concealment, and fanaticism converged. Crane and Harkins reflected upon the enduring lessons of the Holloway Hollow. The case demonstrated the interplay of geography and human intent in facilitating prolonged abuse, the dangers inherent in unchecked isolation, and the capacity for ideological conviction to justify systematic cruelty. Federal authorities implemented recommendations arising from the investigation, standardized missing persons protocols, inter-county communication, and heightened vigilance in remote regions. While these measures could not undo past suffering, they represented a formal attempt to mitigate future risk. Yet, despite the completion of formal investigations, unease lingered in the mountains. Local accounts, journal entries, and subtle observations suggested that the Holloway's imprint extended beyond their immediate tunnels. Crane recorded instances of animals avoiding certain ridges, unusual patterns in forest growth, and faint human-made depressions in distant hollows. Though these occurrences could not be directly linked to active operations, they served as a persistent reminder of the Holloway's methodical presence, a psychological echo embedded in the landscape itself. The surviving child's eventual passing in adolescence marked the final human casualty of the Holloway operation. She succumbed to pneumonia at age 14, weakened by years of malnutrition, trauma, and a body never fully able to adapt to ordinary life. Her death was a solemn closure, Yet Crane and Harkins recognized that the lasting implications of her captivity persisted in the form of documentation, procedural understanding, and collective memory. The Holloway's methodology, while no longer active, remained encoded in reports, journals, and personal accounts, ensuring that the case would endure in both historical and moral consciousness. Crane's closing journal entry reflected the persistent dread that lingered after the Holloway's deaths. The mountains remember. The hollow, though filled and sealed, bears the weight of calculation, cruelty, and belief. These ridges, these hollows, carry the legacy of methodical abuse. And though Prudence and Verity Holloway are gone, the architecture of their intent remains. One wonders, with what ease might another fanatic, guided by ideology and isolation, replicate the cruelty these sisters orchestrated. The land conceals, the world forgets, yet the record endures. Federal archives preserved every recovered diary fragment, skeletal sample, and topographical sketch. Scholars, physicians, and law enforcement studied the materials in subsequent decades, noting the unusual intersection of ideology, isolation, and procedural cruelty. The Holloway case became a reference point in discussions of human behavior, ethical oversight, and the responsibilities of remote communities. The mountains, while no longer actively concealing captives, continued to serve as a repository of collective memory, a natural testament to human capacity for both endurance and horror. And yet, for those who approach the Holloway Hollow, or its surrounding ridges even now, a subtle apprehension persists. Locals who have stumbled across faint depressions or rusted fragments of chain in hidden valleys often report an instinctive sense of avoidance, as though the mountains themselves communicate warning. These experiences, anecdotal though they may be, suggest that the Holloway's influence extends beyond death, beyond closure, into the very perception of the terrain. Whispers among hunters and occasional travelers insist that certain hollows remain unvisited, despite accessible trails. Some claim to hear faint scratching or movement under layers of rubble, particularly during the still hours before dawn. Crane, writing decades later in reflection, cautioned against dismissing such observations entirely. Though Prudence and Verity Holloway were gone, the methodology of control, the imprint of years spent shaping behavior and human form, may linger in ways subtle, perhaps undetectable, yet persistently present. In the final accounting, the Holloway Hollow was sealed, the skeletons catalogued, the diaries preserved, and the surviving child buried. Federal records marked the closure of an extraordinary criminal investigation. Yet the mountains themselves, with their dense forests, narrow valleys, and hidden fissures, retained memory. In every ridge shadow, every abandoned hollow, and every rustling leaf, the residual presence of the Holloway system remained a cautionary tale. That isolation, obsession, and methodical cruelty could leave marks that no fire, flood, or human intervention could entirely erase. For those who wander the Buffalo River region, the story endures quietly, in whispers carried on the wind, in the instinctive avoidance of hidden valleys, in the lingering fear that some fragments of the Holloway's work may persist, waiting unseen, shaping reality in ways impossible to fully measure. Even in the modern era, when the mountains are traversed by hikers, trappers, and surveyors, shadows trace the edges of memory. Prudence and Verity Holloway may be gone, but the architecture of their cruelty endures in the earth, in records, and, most hauntingly, in the lingering fear that the mountains themselves remember.